think we should get started. And as people come on board, I'll let them into the room. I want to welcome everyone to our second presentation of our 2023 spring webinar series. Thank you for joining us. And we are delighted today to have Mark Robinson join us. And Mark has, well, I'll let him introduce himself. But he's going to give us a great presentation about the history of conservation here on the Cape. And without further ado, here's Mark Robinson.
Thank you, Lauren. I'm very happy to be here on a cold Cape Cod morning, and it's nice to give a presentation, a public presentation that I can do in my slippers. So thank you for inviting me. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about the kind of a chronology of how and why land has been preserved on Cape Cod for open space. And of course, that's the work that all of our nonprofit land trusts are doing on a day-to-day basis, like the Chatham Conservation Foundation. The Compact of Cape Cod Conservation Trust was founded in 1986 to assist all of the land trusts on Cape Cod. And I've been working with them since that time to preserve open space, mostly on the nonprofit side, but also with the towns and occasionally in partnership with the state and federal government. So my office is in Brewster, and I'm happy to chat with anybody after the show and through our office in Brewster. So this is a talk that is brand new to me. This is my sort of my beta test, if you will, and very happy to take questions at the end and perhaps some respectful suggestions of how it might be improved, because this is something new to me. But I would like to just run through and acknowledge at the beginning that we are in the land of the people of the first light, and that is the Wampanoag. Here for more than 10,000 years. They're still here. And as you'll see later, we're finding new ways that we can incorporate some of their knowledge and experience of the land into land conservation. So when you think about it, it's really the story of open space conservation on the Cape really only goes back to a little more than 100 years ago. I mean, really in the lifetime of our parents and grandparents, as well as ourselves, this is a fairly recent phenomenon. In 1891, the first land trust in the world was established in Massachusetts, the Trustees of Public Reservations, by a legislative act. And one of the first things they did was to put out a report, a survey of all of the coastal towns, and including Cape Cod. And as you'll see in a minute, they were trying to understand why there was not much open space protected for public use. And they had some very prophetic things to say about the Cape, saying that there will be a time when people come from the cities, driven by the summer heat to seek rest by the sea, but there'll be so many of them that they'll find themselves in the very conditions like those they were trying to escape. And I think anybody who has lived on the Cape in the last 50 years will know that the incredible population boom, particularly after World War II, has resulted on all the pressure on our resources, including our open space. So why do we want to protect land? When there aren't many people around, the land will take care of itself. But as more and more people crowd onto the landscape, you have to be intentional and make a conscious effort to preserve land if you want to save the natural resources and the character of the place. So land is the essential ingredient for preserving all the different natural resources and attributes that we'll be discussing. So for instance, if you want clean drinking water, you need to save land. If you want clean bays and ponds and streams, you need to save land. To the extent that we have the ability to support sustainable agriculture, we have to do that by preserving open space. And if you want to include animals in our landscape, they need habitats. We have many rare species on the Cape. That's not one of them. but our coastal shorebirds nesting here on the Cape is one of the most important natural features that Cape Cod offers to the rest of the world. Obviously, our scenic views. This is Dennis Pond. It's been entirely preserved by the town and land trust, working in conjunction with the state nature conservancy, the Yarmouth Conservation Trust. There was to be a 100-foot long house in that little point sticking out into the pond. We were able to save the last lot, and that's an entirely preserved pond now. Walking trails for human use. People like to walk on trails that are of longer distance. If you want to do that, you need to protect open space to connect them up. So these are all different reasons why we protect open space. And this is a phenomenon that, although it's been done in earnest in the last 100+ years, even the early colonists decided that there was a need for some kind of a conservation ethic. The settlers in Provincetown who were squatting to dry their fish on the flakes on the shore went back into the woods and the dunes to cut down trees that they needed for fire and houses and fences. And they realized very early on, 1714, that they needed to pass a law to prevent too much of the trees from being felled, because they found that it was whipping up the sand flowing into the harbor from the terrific northeast winds of the winter. So I don't know how successful that law was. It's all coming down to enforcement, of course, but it was an early attempt to try to preserve some resources. And of course, all of the Cape did become denuded, and certainly by the mid-1800s, the forest had been cut over for firewood, fences, houses, all the shipbuilding, all the different things that people needed wood for. It was a wood-based economy before oil was discovered. And Thoreau walked through the Cape a couple times in the mid-1800s, and he basically decided that most of the Cape looked like the bottom of the sea laid bare because of all the trees that have been cut down. And that character extended into the 20th century. This is a picture from Falmouth. You can see all of the geography. Not a tree in sight except here by the Garden Gate. And a lot of that was for sheep pastures. Most of the interior of the Cape was cleared, once it was cleared for fires and fireplaces and other wood products, the sheep were turned out there. And most of the old cart paths going through the interior of the Cape were really a way to get the sheep to the pastures in the inland. So all of the woods that we see here on the Cape today, it's second growth or maybe even third or fourth growth forest. The Cape's forest has come back in the last 100 years. And it's not the original forest that we had. It's still mostly pitch pine and oak, but some of them are succeeding to the climax forest of hollies and beech trees. After World War II, development started anew in incredible rates of growth, and that displaced a lot of our new forest. We're also seeing forests being cut down now for ground-mounted solar arrays. Instead of putting them on top of buildings or parking lots, the state has decided to subsidize that activity, make it cheaper to cut down forests to put solar arrays in than putting them where they won't have environmental damage. So I talked about the 1892 survey of the shore. What did the trustees find? Each of our towns, no considerable public holdings, no way to get to the beach. Some towns didn't even have a town common or park, which was something that most of the towns around Boston had. Orleans had a small area around the library. I mean, this was a real paucity of public open spaces. The only exception was in Provincetown, and that was the place called the Province Lands. And the Province Lands, really all of Provincetown was the Province Lands early on in the colonial times. But as more fishermen came and settled in the wonderful harbor and started to build their houses without any real permission to do so, more and more of the province lands were being consumed by ad hoc squatting and development. So in 1893, the state made a very conscious act to declare that there is a boundary beyond which the town should not extend, and that was called the province land, about 4,000 acres. So even though they were common lands held in trust for the people by the state made another conscious effort to identify exactly where those lands should be. And of course, as the Cape Cod National Seashore came in 70 years later, it was taken over by the National Park Service. So early attempts at open space conservation really were private acts of generosity. And this was, I think, in kind of a noblesse oblige approach to doing something for the townspeople. It wasn't done for nature per se, it was done for the townspeople. A lot of these early parks that you'll see. And Mr. Fay, a wealthy Boston person who had a summer place in Woods Hole, he called it Goodwill Park because of the goodwill that the Falmouth residents had shown him and his family. And this was an area near the Long Pond Wellfield, between the Wellfield and downtown. A very popular park now. Interestingly, in 1948, a town meeting said, well, we don't really need a park there. What we need is a place for school. And they voted to undo Mr. Fay's generosity, put a school there. The school was never built. And fortunately, it was rededicated to park purposes. And that's the way it sits today. So a very early example of conservation without calling it conservation. It was just private generosity for the townsfolk. In the early 1900s, a number of towns, including Eastham and Dennis here, started with what they called village improvement societies. And this was kind of taking off on a riff that Thoreau had in the 1840s, in which he said, wouldn't it be wonderful if every town in New England had a committee of people who would be dedicated to preserving the beauty and character of their town? The village improvement societies were the forerunners of what has later become now our town-wide land trusts. But both our organizations intended to preserve some land for public use, the scenic beauty of the town. And this first one in Dennis is right next to the ancient cemetery, the main street of Dennis Village. And the soldiers training field was it wasn't even town owned at that time. It was just a thing kind of left over, and the Village Improvement Society took title to it and improved it, and still maintains it. Another act of individual generosity in 1920, John Bodfish, a Barnstable a local leader and farmer at one point during his lifetime, had a lot of land holdings in the West Barnstable area, and he donated 2 acres at Sandy Neck. I don't know how many he owned, but he felt it was important that the town have some of it so that they would have access to the beautiful long Sandy Neck, 6 miles long barrier beach, which was mostly untitled at that point. People had been squatting out near Beach Point, but he created what is now called Bodfish Park, and that's where the snack bar and parking area is. It's been added on to many times over the years. In fact, in the 1950s, the Commonwealth put together a report identifying where state beaches should go, and places like Horseneck Beach, Damaris Lloyd State Beach on the Buzzards Bay shore, but Sandy Neck was identified by the state as, oh, that'd be a great place for a state beach. And the town of Barnstable kind of rose up and said, I don't think so. If anybody's going to make money off of that beach, it's going to be the town. And the town proceeded to take a lot of the land by eminent domain because of the unclear titles out there. And that activity has continued even into the century. Most recently, 14 acres behind the lighthouse was bought by the town. A number of these early gifts of land were for the birds, quite literally. And here in Chatham, we had the Tern Island, donated in 1926 by the Payne family, later transferred to Mass Audubon, which still continues to operate it. And continuing on that theme, Mr. Austin established his ornithological research station in Wellfleet, which has grown now to be about 1,000 acres and is one of the most heavily visited Audubon sanctuaries in Massachusetts. And in 1931, there was a nonprofit started called the Cape Cod Horticultural Society. So not for the birds necessarily, but for the plants. And again, this was the idea that there were individual reasons why people wanted to save a little bit of land. In this case, for people to walk through unpleasant trails in a woodland setting with flowers and bushes. More recently, just a couple of years ago, that society folded and transferred the land to the trustees of reservations. So the trustees have a few places on the Cape, primarily Mashpee River and Mashpee Wakeby Pond. But this is a small park in the downtown Osterville that they now manage. So as we continued on into the depths of the Depression, Cape Cod was trying to figure out a way to make money for itself. Fishing had kind of collapsed, and the farmers found they couldn't compete with the better soils out west. And so what did we have? We could sell our charm. And so the Chamber of Commerce decided that in order to preserve our charm, we had to protect some of our natural beauties. This is a postcard from the 1930s that showed how you could drive to Cape Cod and come over the brand new bridges built over the canal in 1935 and continue on paved roads all the way out through the Lower Cape. You'll notice what's missing here is Route 6. So this was clearly just a Route 6A or Route 28 phenomenon at the time. That same year, a woman named Addie Nickerson, who had married into the Nickerson clan of Cape Cod, they built the large estate now known as Ocean Edge and Route 6A in Brewster, that beautiful, used to be the La Salette Seminary. And her husband died as an early, I think he died in his 50s, and she wanted to dedicate his old hunting and fishing grounds that he had assembled on the south side of Route 6A in Brewster. Gave it to the state as a state park. It's now the most popular camping space on Cape Cod. People wait nervously at midnight on New Year's Eve in order to get a campsite for the next summer. First come, first serve. So even during World War II, there was an effort to identify important bird nesting habitat, and that's why Monomoy was declared a National Wildlife Refuge. And almost 30 years later, part of it was declared as a federal wilderness area, the only one in Massachusetts. So it's another superlative for Cape Cod. 1957 was important for many things, including my birth year. Everything on we're going to talk about has been during my lifetime. 1957 was when the state authorized the first wetlands, the first Conservation Commission Act. And that was the intention, was to give the towns a board to identify important natural areas and figure out ways that you might want to preserve them. And so Barnstable was the first one to set up one on the Cape and was one of the first ones in Massachusetts. Dennis and Brewster followed soon thereafter. And in 1961, the very first land donated to a town specifically for conservation, not for birds, necessarily not for plants, but for conservation of the habitat, was donated in Brewster by Miss Lucy Chapman, a retired school teacher, the land across the street. In 1959, federal fisheries biologist Rachel Carson, working in Woods Hole, was very supportive of a federal effort to identify important seashores that could be added to the national park system. And she advocated creating a wilderness of beach and high dunes on Cape Cod, kind of the forerunner of the Cape Cod National Seashore idea, which was just getting off the ground. And sure enough, with a lot of political might behind the incoming young president, President Kennedy, the Cape Cod National Seashore was established with 27,000 acres along the backshore of the Cape. 6 towns from Chatham to Provincetown comprise the National Seashore. And the important thing to note is that it was not just President Kennedy behind it. It was very important to have a bipartisan effort. That's Republican Massachusetts Senator Leverett Saltonstall, who had previously been the governor, whose staff had written the act. And so Jonathan Moore of Orleans and David Martin of Barnstable were on the staff at the time for Senator Saltonstall. They wrote the act that Kennedy passed. And it was a very innovative thing at the time. Nobody had quite figured out how do you make a national seashore, a national park where people are living. David Martin was an attorney trained in zoning issues, and he figured out that there should be zoning in the seashore. He said it should be 3-acre zoning. People who were already living in the park could stay there for a specified length of time. For houses that were built after 1959, they could be condemned and taken. So it was a very creative balancing act between preservation and continuing residential use. There are about 600 private inholdings within the park now. And you may have read recently that some of the new federal money is being used to demolish some of those abandoned structures. The Seashore Agency has not had money to take down the dilapidated and demolish those structures, but hopefully they'll be able to do some more of that now. 1962 was also the beginning of really the land trust movement here on the Cape, and good old Chatham led the way with the establishment of the Chatham Conservation Foundation. These are the names of the original founders: Mason, Bloomer, Gray, Clayton Love, Bierce, and Eldridge, and some good Cape Cod names within that group. And the first bit of land was donated for conservation purposes to a local land trust on Cape Cod, Fox Island out in the harbor. And so that's a landmark. When you look out there, all the things that we'll talk about for land trusts, it all started with that little island out there. Cape Cod was also in the forefront of worrying about the loss of its salt marshes and barrier beaches to accommodate marine development. So a lot in the 1950s and 60s, particularly, towns were creating these boat basins out of the salt marsh mouths, the creeks coming down into the bays. This is the one in Barnstable Harbor. And you can see on the right, the Maraspin Creek wandering through the salt marsh. That's what it did. It wandered out into the harbor. But in the late 50s, as a public works, the town said, we can make money by creating boat slips. Let's dredge it out. So the state senator, Alan Jones of Barnstable at the time, was worried about that. And he crafted a bill that was passed. It was really the precursor of the Wetlands Protection Act. It didn't do a whole lot. It simply said that if somebody wanted to dredge out a marsh, they would have to have a public hearing before the select board at the time, and also notify the state. So there hadn't been any real permitting other than a federal Army Corps permit. And my understanding is the Army Corps did not get notice of all of the dredging projects that were intended to go on at the time. So this is a way to at least take stock of what was being proposed and what might be lost. Other harbors like this includes the Seward Harbor in Dennis, Saquatucket and Harwich, to some degree Rock Harbor in Orleans and Eastham. So that really led to the first identification of wetlands as being important, other than being mosquito breeding grounds. And it all started here on the Cape. The other thing that started here on the Cape in 1967 in the town of Dennis was an intentional effort by the town leaders to go to town meeting with a package of properties that they thought were important to preserve. And people like Henry Kelly, who's still with us, and Norton Nickerson, who's no longer here, kind of led that charge. And the idea that the town could go and raise money through taxes to buy land started in 1967 as a comprehensive project or program. Norton Nickerson was an interesting fellow. He grew up in Dennis near Bass River. His family still has property there. And he became a widely known biology professor at Tufts University, helped to write some of the first Wetlands Protection Act, came up with some of the definitions for the resource areas. And one of his favorite things to do on the family lands out on the Bass River was to lead the Lady Slipper Walk every spring until his death in 2011. And this little island out in the river had the biggest concentration of lady slippers that I've ever seen. And lots of people like to go and have him lead the walk as a professional botanist. Very interesting. The lady slippers are no longer there. Their demise almost perfectly coincided with Dr. Nickerson's death. Go figure. So now we're into the 1980s, and the 70s and 80s were really when large, sprawling residential subdivisions on half-acre lots were just running rampant all over the Cape. And the Cape had the highest rate of growth for any other part of the state during the 1980s. We added an extra 35% to our housing stock from 1980 to 1990. So this is when people decided that, oh, there's a lot of cheap land in the interior. Let's go sprawl some subdivisions out there. And it was this sprawl that I believe created the anxiety in the minds of the residents and the newcomers that we're going to lose Cape Cod if we don't do something about it. And I think that anxiety provoked the social change where people were willing to put their money on the line by raising taxes to preserve open space before it was gone. So this was before the time of the Land Bank or the Community Preservation Act. There weren't any ready sources of local funding to buy open space. So people went to town meetings and voted to tax themselves to do that. And they raised over $100 million in a 4-year span. And we're able to preserve 4,500 acres with that money. That sounds like a lot of money. It was dwarfed by the $27 billion of real estate transactions on the Cape during the 1990s. Just to give you one example, the town of Barnstable alone in 1986, there were 1,000 building permits pulled. And that means that there were 3 new concrete foundations being poured every day of the year. Just a staggering amount of development. So that peak in 1986 also engendered, again, this anxiety engendered more land trusts coming to the fore. By the end of the 1980s, every town had a local land conservation trust. Chatham had led the way in 1962. By the end of the 1980s, all the other towns had copied Chatham. And in 1986, 6 of these land trusts affiliated themselves together in a formal network that they called the Compact of Cape Cod Conservation Trust, which is still the oldest regional alliance of land trusts in the nation. The only one that's older is the National Land Trust Alliance from 1982. You'll see on the right a list of all the other places in the United States that have gathered these land trusts together to try to make an efficiency and an economy of scale in their work. So from our original 6 groups, we now have 32 groups that belong to the Compact, including some of the watershed associations, which understand this connection between saving land in order to save water quality. So groups like Buzzards Bay Coalition, Oyster Pond Environmental Trust, Friends of the Herring River, they've all joined the Compact to support open space. So in October of 1987, we had a meltdown of the crash of 87, they called it. The building boom stopped and people got nervous about their finances and they stopped buying open space as well. Again, think about it. If you're not building as much, you're not feeling as anxious. So maybe we don't need to buy any more open space, or not as much as we had been. And here, a little graph on the right, you can see how that the number of acres that were purchased declined dramatically after 1987 for about a decade. During that time, there was an effort by Cape Cod environmental groups to propose a Cape Cod land bank so that there would be a steady source of revenue to buy land instead of having to rely on taxpayers all the time. And those initial land banks were patterned after the Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket land banks, which has a surcharge on real estate transfers. So when you sell a home, you pay an extra fee into the land bank that's used strictly to buy open space. Those ideas failed on the Cape primarily because of the opposition of the realtors and builders. Uh, and we came back in 1998 with a new version that was based on a property tax surcharge so that everybody paid, not just the people who were selling their homes. And so in 1998, Governor Dukakis was able to sign a bill passed by the legislature with grassroots effort back here on the Cape. And these were some of the leaders who got together. It was a very strange set of bedfellows. So we had Democrats and Republicans, we had county commissioners, we had the state legislative delegation, we had the grassroots efforts. 30 groups joined the Friends of the Cape Cod Land Bank and supported the advertising and Get Out the Vote campaign. Very interesting here on the right, you'll see Bob Wilkinson, who was a leader in the real estate community, and he made sure that the Cape Cod Board of Realtors supported this particular bill, and they did. And Elliott Carr rallied the bankers on Cape Cod, and we had a press conference where all the leaders of the banks, including the larger banks like Bank of Boston and the Cape Cod Co-op, Cape Cod Bank and Trust, Cape Cod 5, Siemens Bank, they all got together and endorsed the land bank. Because why? Because they knew that if this was to be a place worth attracting people to, we needed to have our open space preserved as much as possible. So very forward-thinking business leaders. Makes a lot more compelling argument if they say it rather than I say it. So what was the result of this land bank? Don't expect you to read all this. You can study it later. But so it passed in the legislature. Now it had to pass in each one of the 15 towns. It was an opt-in provision. So a town could vote to adopt it, or they didn't have to. It was up to them. If they wanted to put 3% on extra on their property tax, it would be used solely to buy open space. And as you see, 58% majority said yes, and each one of the 15 towns said yes. So it was a very inspiring result, and indicated to me and others that people will continue to support open space acquisition, even if it means paying for it themselves. And frankly, with the 200+ million that was spent to buy properties in that decade, only about 10% was subsidized by the state. So it really was Cape Codders paying for their own enjoyment of open space. The other thing that started to happen about this time was because the land trusts themselves, the nonprofit groups, were maturing and evolving and getting more sophisticated about their work, they were able to partner with the towns. And about 40% of the projects involved a direct partnership between the town and the land trust, their local land trust, as you see here on the sign in Dennis. So again, another 4,500 acres was preserved through the land bank in this 10-year period. Land had become more expensive, as it always seems to do. And in 2007, it became evident that we had to think about the horizon of the land bank. It was intended to be a 20-year program. So it was going to sunset in 2020. At that time, our state legislative delegation said, we got to jump on board this Community Preservation Act. And that's a thing that the towns can use on an indefinite basis. There's no sunset provision. People can opt in or opt out. Again, 3% surcharge on property tax. And so most towns voted to shift, abandon the land bank surcharge in favor of the same 3% surcharge on property tax to support the Community Preservation Act, and that supports open space, affordable housing, recreation, and historic preservation. So it also engendered some matching monies from the state on an annual basis, which has fluctuated up and down, but that's something that the land bank didn't have beyond an initial slug of 15 million that the state put into the land bank. So most towns decided that this was a good bet and a way to continue this effort, perhaps slicing the pie with some other interests, but being able to indefinitely preserve open space with this funding source. And so all of the Cape Towns still have their Community Preservation Act and a committee that reviews projects on an annual basis, makes recommendations to town meeting approves the purchases. In the year 2000, the legislature, based on support from the Upper Cape communities in particular, and Congressman Delahunt at the time, worked to identify the 15,000 acres at the north end of the Mass Military Reservation, which was important because it feeds the aquifer for the towns of Sandwich, Bourne, Mashpee, and Falmouth. And so this is land that was intended to be set aside from intense use by the military. There are some green exercises that are intended to go out there. There's also a proposal for a 180 acre clear cut for a machine gun range. But the intent of trying not to develop this area so that could be preserved for the water quality of the Upper Cape was important. And so this is a nice anchor. Most people don't know that the Mass Military Reservation actually came out of a state forest at the time in 1910. That was the Shawnee Kroll State Forest. There's still a remnant of that state forest north of Route 6, but everything south of Route 6 was dedicated to military purposes for World War I and World War II. And it continues on a limited basis today. So the result of all of these efforts by the town and the land trusts in particular resulted in almost a doubling of open space in the past 30 years. And you can see the big jump there, 1995 to 2007, that was the land bank era. And also coincided with the 15,000 acres at the Mass Military Reservation. But you can see a steady increase since 2007 based on the Community Preservation Act, the work of the land trusts, and the partnerships that have gone forward. Also interesting to note, a first on the Cape is the creation of the first Native American-led land trust. This is the Native Land Conservancy, headquartered in Mashpee, but working throughout the eastern United States. In fact, they're just taking a conservation easement on 700 acres in Alabama that's tribal land. So the Native Land Conservancy is a new partner to work regionally with the towns, the land trusts. And in 2015, the Dennis Conservation Land Trust offered what we call a cultural respect agreement with the Native Land Conservancy to invite the members of the Conservancy to come on to Dennis Conservation Land Trust properties to perform ceremony and cultural practices. And this was renewed and extended in 2021 on a permanent basis for all of their properties, even the incoming ones. A very inspiring bit of cooperation by the Dennis Conservation Land Trust. Last year, the town of Mashpee also extended this type of access for cultural practices onto one of its newer town conservation properties. So we're really pleased to see another thing starting on the Cape. I've often said that the Cape is a petri dish of experimentation and innovative land use regulations, but also in the open space sphere. And the compact itself is a testament to that, I think. One of the things that the compact has promoted is not shying away from complicated projects. You're not intended to look at this other than to realize all of these boxes are sources of funding, organizations, public and private, county, state, federal, all of them working together to save land, 40 acres on Chapin Beach and Dennis. And part of the work of the compact is to organize these arrangements and these partnerships. A big shout out to State Senator Dan Wolf and his staff at that time. Were really managing the public monies while the compact and Dennis were organizing the private monies to come into the project. This is preserved and replenished the only shellfish hatchery on the Cape as well. The ARC is the name of the shellfish hatchery. It's out there on Chapin Beach and supplies quahog and oyster seeds to all of the towns on the Cape. Perhaps the most inspiring thing to me during my career was attending on a beautiful fall day in Brewster a couple of years ago and seeing 1,500 people show up to do one thing and one thing only, which is to tax themselves $26 million to save the Cape Cod sea camps. It was just a staggering display of purpose by the townspeople that we're not going to let the Cape Cod Bay shore and the Long Pond property go the way of the next big condominium development that would have shut off access to the beach. And so for the first time now, Brewster has a town beach that's accessible to residents, as opposed to the number of small, narrow, cramped town landings that they've had over the past 100 years. And so this was an amazing feat. And again, it was a partnership because the Brewster Conservation Trust, the Mass Audubon, agreed to raise $3 million towards the 26 million. And we'll hold a conservation restriction on the 66 acres on Long Pond as shown here. So what? Did we save Cape Cod? In my experience, I think what we've done is we've changed the Cape from having pockets of development surrounded by open space into having pockets of open space surrounded by development. I don't think we've prevented it from becoming suburbanized. I think we have prevented it from becoming a true suburb, only because of this incredible outpouring of affection for the Cape's natural beauty, its natural resources, and people willing to do the hard work, going to town meetings, going to town boards, joining their land trusts, supporting initiatives, all of which are crafted to have the resources available to strike when properties become available and need to be preserved. So have we saved enough of the Cape? Well, the latest figures indicate that we have preserved about 40% of the land mass. That includes our wetlands. And we've developed almost half of the Cape so far. That means there's about 14% up for grabs. And will it be developed or will it be protected? Obviously, we still need land for lots of different things, for affordable housing, but we also need it for things like protecting our well fields, our public drinking water supplies, found primarily in the interior of the Cape, where the water resources are plentiful. Only 36% of those areas shown in green here on the map have been protected. So if you want to save water, you have to save land. And I think we need to identify all of the remaining lands within these public well field zones and do our best to protect as much as we can of them. And the towns do have very good resource maps. They know where these parcels are. They know where the zones of contribution to the wells are. It's a question of doing the outreach, getting the money, voting to buy the land. And so there's still a lot of work to do. And I think that this idea that well, you're done. You had your shot at it in the last century is not accurate. There are places that we can undevelop and bring back some properties to their native, to their natural habitats. The new theme of eco-restoration, where some of these abandoned areas can be restored, including cranberry bogs that can be brought back to natural functioning wetlands as habitat and water quality resources. So have we done enough? I don't think so. If I thought we had done enough, I don't think I'd still be doing this work. It's the best work in the world. I really enjoy it. And and this is what we do it for. I think it's the next generation that can appreciate the Cape. And I think that's almost exactly 45 minutes, and I'm happy to take questions if you'd like to ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. This has been wonderful. Really appreciate all that you do for not just the land trust as as organizations, but for everyone here on the Cape. So if anybody has any questions, you can unmute yourself, or you can put questions in the chat box. We can read them there. I'm gonna share a screen here. Let's see, do that. Maybe. Okay, we have a question from, oh, well, thanks, Mark, from Steve. Any other questions? I have a question, Mark. You made a couple of references, and a couple of the slides you showed reference the Cape Cod Commission. And I know many people might want to know what exactly that does and who they are.
Sure. In 1990, the legislature adopted the Cape Cod Commission Act, which was a way to um, formalize what had been previously an advisory planning commission for the county into a regulatory agency as well as a planning agency. So it's based also on the work of the Martha's Vineyard Commission, which had become a regulatory authority prior to 1990. And the idea was to take projects that had perceived regional impacts, either by their size or location, and to have a regional body with professional planners in different disciplines, transportation, natural resources, water quality, and others, to examine the proposals and decide whether whether the net benefit of the project outweighed the net detriments, impacts on resources, and whether the projects could be conditioned in a way to be allowed to advance to the towns for their permitting process. So it's an extra layer of regulation, not for every project on Cape Cod, but for larger ones. And so it's been around now since 1990. I think most of its benefit has been in the preemption of some really bad things that have been proposed elsewhere that developers will not even try to bring to the Cape because they know that they'd be up against this Cape Cod Commission.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Well, I do want to thank everyone for participating. We have additional webinars coming up. Check our website and stay in touch. Go to our website, sign up for our e-newsletter, fill out a volunteer form, follow us on Facebook, and become a member. Thanks again, Mark. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Lauren. Nice to see everybody. Enjoy the day.
Take care. Bye-bye. Oh, one more chat.
Oh.
Oh, is there any legislation we should support? Asks Nancy and Kathy.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy and Kathy. Well, the primary one that's of interest to me is the state conservation land tax credit, and that's a program that enables people who donate land or sell it cheaply for conservation to receive up to $75,000 as a state refundable tax credit for donating or taking less than the land is worth. And right now, there's only $2 million available statewide each year. It really should be $5 million based on the number of people who want to have access to that program. There's a long waiting list. And that legislation, I'm happy to provide information about it from my office next week. But that's something that's really compelling and immediate.
I'd also like to add, depending on which town you're in, at town meetings, the local Community Preservation Commission makes recommendations for funding each year. So here in Chatham, for example, they just put out their recommendations, which were in the Chronicle last week or the week before. So certainly voting on those types of things on a very local granular level is helpful. For example, I think 120,000 was requested from, of course, studying sea level rise and marsh migration here in Chatham. We at the foundation have requested money to improve our trail maps and signage. So those types of things, look at the money that Mark referenced, that all the towns have access to. That's the Community Preservation Act money.
Lauren, if anybody would like a copy of the show, I sent you a PDF, so you can send it out to them.
Yes, we will be following up and everybody will get a copy of the slides. So if you have more information or want to look through it again, and we are recording this, so we will at some point have that available to share as well.
Great.
Any other questions? Thank you again, everyone, and hope you have a great weekend. Stay warm.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mark. Bye-bye.